All right. Thank you, everybody. Welcome to today's Includes National Network webinar on adaptive practices to networked improvement community frameworks, or NICs, for deepening equity and inclusion and increasing efficacy. My name is Leanne DeLizer, and I am new to SRI and have recently joined the Includes National Network project from the SRI leadership, and I hope to get a chance to get to know all of you. I see some familiar names in the chat from my previous role at Computer Science for All prior to coming here to SRI. So welcome. It's exciting to be here with you. Please, as you're coming in, keep introducing yourself if you haven't dropped that in already. Next slide, Dylan. So I just want to start with our conversational practices that we value here at Includes. First, we acknowledge each one another as equals in these conversations that we're about to have. We try to stay curious about each other and our perspectives and our visions and our values. We recognize that we need each other's help to become better listeners. We slow down so that we can have time to think and reflect. We pause to create space for everyone to engage. And underneath it all, we expect it to be a little messy at times. And so we welcome all of you to engage and share both in the chat and in the breakout rooms eventually in order to get a chance for your all voices to be lifted. And we're really excited today to welcome members of 4 of our alliances who are going to share a little bit about what they've been doing for the networked improvement community model for systems of change. And Sarah, yes, we'll post those conversational practices in the chat so they persist after this slide. Dylan, can you go to the next slide for me, please? So in our time together, we're going to go through a bunch of things. And I think this is the point where I should hand this over to Jennifer, or Jen, who's going to take us through the content today and help all of our partners share. Jen?
Great. Thank you so much, Leanne. My name's Jen Iridi, and I'm with the STEM Push Network. So this session really was conceived at an in-person convening of NSF Includes Alliances I think it was almost 2 years ago when several of us were together and we realized we were all utilizing networked improvement communities or improvement science, and that we were all really learning a lot. We were learning a lot about how to do the work well, how to meaningfully infuse equity. And that's where we were like, oh, maybe we could, bring our learnings together. And maybe if we were learning a lot and having some insights, that others out there in the NSF network would also find this valuable and would be interested in engaging in conversation around adapting networked improvement community frameworks and improvement science tools. So here we are. Today, what we would like to do is spend a short bit of time grounding all of ourselves in a shared framework for networked improvement communities and improvement science, which we'll do in just a moment. And then you'll have a chance to hear about some of the adaptive practices that each of 4 alliances have built and innovated. You'll hear from the STEM Push Network, the All Rise Alliance, Native Fuse Alliance, and the First 2 Network. And then we will have the opportunity to actually have an exchange of information through some breakout rooms and discussions, processing some of what you just heard from those alliances and sharing your own experiences. So before we move on to a framework, I think we have a quick poll that we'd like for you to do to gauge your experience with networked improvement communities and improvement science. So I believe that will pop up for you now. And if you could take a second to answer that question. And are we going to have the poll results shared? There they are. So we have a very heterogeneous group. So we have folks who are unfamiliar, really new to the work, and then some that are very familiar or familiar. So we're going to work together today to, try to make the content of what we share today appropriate and relevant for all folks who are in this space. So if at any point we begin talking about things that perhaps using some acronyms or language that you're unfamiliar with and it's going to interfere with your ability to follow along, please ask in the chat, questions in the chat, so that we can address those and respond as we go. Great. So I'm going to kick us off with sort of bringing to the group and to ground our work together in a shared framework and understanding of networked improvement communities, especially thinking of them as a model for systems change. So NICs have been used in education for about 20 years as a means to affect systems change focused on critical problems of practice. The four alliances that are going to share their work today have all used either NICs, we call Networked Improvement Communities NICs, or improvement science as change strategies in their work. So this first segment, we're going to ground it in this shared understanding of frameworks for networked improvement communities. Next slide. So NICs are intentionally designed and structured networks that bring individuals and organizations with a range of expertise and experience together to conduct joint work in a disciplined way in order to solve a shared problem of practice. So in doing so, networked improvement communities bring together two big ideas: networked communities and improvement science. So NICs take advantage of the fact that learning is social for humans, right? That we actually learn from the process of engaging with one another, and that it takes people working together to solve complex problems. So the other key pillar of a NIC is that it uses improvement science as a methodology for conducting that joint work. Thus, network members, they work together in a disciplined way to identify needed changes, test them, share the data and insights about those changes so that we can accelerate our progress towards systemic change. Next slide. So improvement science is a set of principles and tools that constitute a systematic approach for solving problems of practice. This cycle involves understanding the problem that the NIC is organized around and the system that produces the problem, focusing the collective efforts of the network through a shared theory of development, of improvement, generating ideas for change that are aligned with that theory of improvement, testing and building evidence in support of promising changes, and then working to spread and scale the changes that are shown to lead to improvement. So what's been really transformative about this approach is that it involves spending a good amount of time understanding the problem of concern and the system that's producing it. In education, especially, there's been a history of thinking that we understand a problem and then jumping right into solutions. And so that means then that underlying assumptions about the nature of the problem often go unaddressed. Solutions then scale quickly and fail quickly. And those failures then end up being blamed on the students and the communities that the solutions were meant to serve, rather than on the root causes of the actual problem. So improvement science really looks to understand exactly what the problem under exploration is before we start looking for solutions. So next slide. So networked improvement communities leverage improvement science within a network to accelerate progress. So it's the power of working together in a structured and disciplined way. So Jennifer Russell, who is a former colleague of mine now at Vanderbilt, and some of her other colleagues, they offer a useful framework for thinking about the structures of these networked improvement communities. So the NIC comes together around a shared problem of practice, in which the key conditions and drivers that must be changed to lead to the desired, I'm sorry, I'm saying the wrong thing. Could you add a click there? There we go, thank you. So the NICs coming together around the shared problem of practice, and it's critical for that shared problem of practice to cohere this network that's comprised of different sectors and different role groups, right? So what brings us together is this shared problem that we're trying to solve. Then each NIC develops a theory of practice improvement in which the key conditions or drivers that must be changed to lead to that desired improvement are articulated. And so this serves as a way to hypothesize about what needs to happen and as a way to document learning about those hypotheses as we get deeper into the work. So then network members also learn about improvement science methods and embed them within their practice. This generates cyclical testing and a cyclical testing infrastructure around that problem of practice. Then network leaders also build out a measurement infrastructure that's tethered to that theory of practice improvement so that we can understand what those testing cycles are telling us about our theory. So that way we're learning from our work and we're updating our ideas about how we will continue to affect change. Now, all of those functions in that core require leadership, organizational structures, and implementation approaches that center that problem of practice. And lastly, that all surrounding all of that, it's taking place within a network culture that ideally supports and deepens the work to solve the problem of practice and must be intentionally built and nurtured. So with each of the alliances today, they're going to be relating their work and their insights back to this NIC initiation and development framework. So you'll see this over and over again. Okay, next slide. So now I'm going to change hats and I'm going to talk with you about the STEM push experience with networked improvement communities and improvement science. So my colleague Lori and I are really delighted to get to share our STEM push journey with this NIC model and to share a sampling of the ways that we elaborated or adapted the improvement tools and routines to more effectively infuse equity into our work. So STEM Push, next slide, please. STEM Push grew out of our experiences as directors of pre-college STEM programs. These are outreach programs that exist for high school students trying to support and enrich on the pathway to post-secondary education. And as directors of these programs, our team members witnessed inequity in the college admissions process firsthand. The diversity that we would observe in our pre-college STEM program participation and how those students were excelling were not later observed in our higher education institutions' incoming cohorts. So many of these pre-college STEM program students are engaging in college-level mentored research, producing original research, and activating important STEM knowledge and skills, but it wasn't translating into freshman classes. So we set out to make pre-college STEM programs better at broadening participation in STEM undergraduate study. Next slide. So the STEM Push Network is the STEM Pathways for Underrepresented Students to Higher Education, PUSH. And we created the first nationwide network of pre-college STEM programs that are accredited for meeting quality standards for broadening participation. So we brought together this group of folks and we helped them strengthen their practice around engaging in culturally sustaining practices and linking them to higher education institutions. So our vision is based on the following. If pre-college STEM programs utilize research-based practices for broadening participation and can communicate their value to admissions offices, then more underrepresented students will gain admissions to undergraduate study and persist in STEM. So next slide. So our goals broadly at STEM Push are to work with our partners to develop this pre-college improvement community, a NIC, developing an accreditation system for STEM pre-college programs, providing an equitable evidence-based metric to higher education institutions so that they can consider participation in these accredited STEM pre-college STEM programs for admissions purposes, and then to scale and sustain this work broadly. Today, we'll be focused on that first goal here, which was our pre-college STEM program networked improvement community. All right, next slide. We've recruited and onboarded over 45 pre-college STEM programs across the country. You can see marked here. Next slide. And we meet in person for convenings twice per year to celebrate our improvements and to launch new improvement efforts so that we better serve Black, Latina, and Indigenous students. Next slide. I'm not going to show you our driver diagram, but what you will see is here, and actually it's not showing on the slide for some reason. Some of the text is missing. So our network aim, there they go. Okay, they were animated when they shouldn't be. Sorry about that. There might be one more, Dylan. There we go. So the STEM Push Network aim is that by 2026, the STEM Push Network will increase the rate of Black, Latina, and Indigenous pre-college STEM program students' admissions and persistence in STEM undergraduate study. And what you'll see here, we're not showing you our whole big theory of improvement that's often shown in a driver diagram. We're just showing you these four primary drivers where we do improvement cycles around. We use the Plan, Do, Study, Act methodology to work on recruiting more and different students, to nurture STEM identity and sense of belonging, to develop competencies that matter for the practice of STEM, and to strengthen college-going pathway supports. Next slide. After we engage in our improvement cycles, our Plan, Do, Study, Act, when we have evidence of particular practices and routines working well, we bring those together and we produce improvement packages, a sampling of which you see here, that are available on our website so that others can use these tested practices in their own work. So with that groundwork, I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague Lori DeLele O'Connor to share how we adapted and extended some of the traditional tools and routines for NICS in our work.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jen. And thank you everybody for being here. And Dylan, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Thank you. So as Jen walked us through first the background on NICS and improvement science and told you more about our network, the STEM Push Network, and our origins and focus, as she said, I want to turn us to the ways that we have engaged and adapted the tools and routines of improvement science to build toward racial equity in these pre-college STEM spaces. So as you note here, Jen said you'd see it again, and here it is. We drew from Jennifer Russell and colleagues' framework for the initiation of networked improvement communities. And I won't go into detail since Jen explained this so well just a few minutes ago, but I want to note that our focus is the key adaptations to aspects of the framework that you can see here. And I think if you click, Dylan, I think we have some arrows. There's one, and I think there's one more. Okay, that you can see here. And we actually go into more depth about 5 different adaptations we made in an upcoming publication that will be in a special issue of Frontiers in Education focused on equity and improvement science. But today we're highlighting 2 of those to give you a sense of what that could look like and what we mean. First, building living community norms, which connects with Russell and colleagues framing around the culture, norms, and identity of a network. And then second, developing scaffolds that center the voices and experiences of minoritized youth and their families and communities within that Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle that Jen mentioned. So next slide, please, Dylan. Thank you. So one adaptation that we made is embodied in our community norms. And you saw that we started today with community norms. Ours are a little bit different, but in particular, we were focused on the need to build living community norms and also ways to respond to violations of those norms. So traditional improvement science frameworks in education offer principles to guide this work, as you saw in Russell and colleagues' framework, where they identify the need for a culture, norms, and identity that's consistent with network aims. But they lack explicit community norms that are enacted with a focus on racial equity. And so the network initiation and development framework centers trust, both network members' trust of each other, and then trust of the leadership, which we refer to as the hub, as a critical component early in the work. And so from the outset of our work in STEM Push, we recognized that as a leadership team or a hub, we would need to create a space where programs could come, they could fail quickly, as we say in improvement science. They could nurture a culture in which the power dynamics were examined, in which diversity of thought was honored, and intentionally we were establishing and fostering trust, not only between the hub and the network members, but also between members themselves. So our initial norms were the product of the collective contribution of our hub. And that was brought in from our own practice, our professional knowledge, our experience in other communities where we were trying to create equitable spaces. And at that point, at the onset of our network, they really reflected our best understanding of what incoming pre-college STEM programs might need to establish these relationships and to engage in this collective work, as well as understandings from research on what it meant to develop and foster racial equity within organizations. But as we engaged in our work, it was clear that the norms weren't truly living, in that they didn't fully reflect our community's needs and the people involved, but were really more of a reflection of what we knew as hub leadership. So as the network grew, we reintroduced the norms with explicit space to comment on and introduce new norms from network members. So as a result, what you see here, the inclusion of a second cohort of our STEM Push network led to an additional norm about respecting each other's time, and then also recognizing when we needed space for a pause, or to process. In addition, as we moved through our work, a specific small group discussion, led to a violation of some norms, something we hadn't really accounted for. And this led us to recognize that we didn't have a response protocol for such a violation. And so as a result, again, these living norms, we then added an additional norm of apologize and work to repair damage if you violate a norm. So because our work is ongoing, we continue to open space for reflection on our norms, as well as revision and additions to them. And we ground our work in them at the beginning of all network meetings, similar to the way we did here, and then continue to assess our perspectives on whether we're adhering to those. We do this in periodic surveys where we, at the onset, measured norm adherence after each network engagement. So in that way, we looked on a 3-point scale to whether this was regularly followed, occasionally followed, rarely followed, so that in the onset, we could make quick adjustments to our meetings and to our facilitation. And then after a year of engaging, we moved to a more annual cadence to monitor these. And we have very high rates of reported norm adherence. So ranging between 83 and 100% for things that we regularly follow. So our network sees these as living and followed norms. So in summary, that in thinking of that adaptation, we found that our initial goals, the creating shared understanding and commitment, developing trust, establishing a safe space, facilitating equitable dynamics, remained important to centering our goal of racial equity. But we learned that through programs, experience, and engagement, we had to add to and adapt these norms to demonstrate that they were community norms, not just the hub's norms, and to learn how to address any violations that might come up. So that is one adaptation. I'd like to tell you a little bit about a second one. So if you'd move to the next slide, please, Dylan. So a second adaptation we made was to our Plan, Do, Study, Act template. And you heard Jen talk about PDSAs and the work that we fostered around change ideas. So in particular, clearly infusing scaffolds that center the voices and experiences of racially minoritized young people and their families and communities. So as Jen mentioned, change is core to work that you do in a networked improvement community. And in many ways, similar to our norms, our initial change ideas were designed by the hub. We drew them from research and content connected to our root cause analyses. These were designed to be high leverage based on the needs of what we saw as the needs of our pre-college programs. And they also had the need, in addition to do these, to learn about STEM Push, learn about improvement science, design and execute a cycle at the same time. So we were trying to take that load from them. And so we used this template, which you can see reflects a traditional view of a PDSA cycle. However, our network health survey, our hub reflective debriefing routines, our analysis sort of signaled to us early that while the tests while the changes we were testing were grounded in equity, they were not necessarily implemented in ways that would truly center and drive an impact on equity, and in particular, the voices and experiences and specific outcomes of minoritized youth and their families. So that was absent. And because our program served a range of students, we noticed they were not necessarily differentiating the outcomes and experiences of Black, Latina, and Indigenous students who were the focus and motivation of STEM Push. So if you would move to the next slide, please, Dylan. We decided that what we needed to do was really change our PDSA template to recognize the localized contexts and voices of minoritized youth and their families that needed to be part of every cycle. And that included not only the design, but also the data analysis. And so to address the gaps we were seeing, we did a few things. We deliberately engaged programs in the identification and development of change ideas through co-design processes in the second round of our change ideas. We introduced empathy interviews as a tool to better obtain and incorporate the voices of minoritized youth. And program leaders use those empathy interviews to bring the perspective of current students and program alumni. And we considered the importance of youth involvement in the process. And so you can see here the questions that we engaged then as part of our PDSA template for involving minoritized youth in the process, explicitly naming how the changes would affect minoritized youth, and explicitly prompting leaders as they were going through the PDSA template to consider this in their data collection. So we saw that in the first round of work, and I'll just use the example of one change we did, which is around recruitment, there were no programs integrating student voice. Once we added the new questions, 75% of the next round of leaders engaged in this change package integrated students into their recruitment. And one program is a great example, co-designed a recruitment process with her student leadership team. She engaged them in storytelling, gave them time to carefully design and craft their own STEM stories, and then they recruited peers in their schools, using their stories as a way to interest them. So you can see here, again, just a high level, how we adapted that template and the practices around that to really focus a PDSA cycle that was more generalized to be focused on supporting programs and engaging in that racial equity goal. We also adjusted our improvement group facilitation protocols to ask more explicitly about how Black, Latina, and/or Indigenous students experience these changes and to what effect. So we believe that due to these changes, the data that we saw then in the network health survey, when we were assessing for continuous improvement, deepened our grounding and probing for the minoritized student experiences and outcomes. So next slide, please, Dylan. So I know we have time we need to move on to the next groups, but I just wanted to offer those examples to you so that you could see the way we adapted improvement tools to better reflect a focus on racial equity. And this just gives you our information and information if you want to see more about the work that the STEM Push Network is doing. So I appreciate it.
Thank you for that, Lori. And thank you, Jen, for doing the introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Ana Tanguma Gallegos, and I'm the Associate Director for the Center for Broadening Participation in STEM. I'm also the co-PI for the All Rise Alliance grant here. And I was trying to put a timer on myself. Our All Rise Alliance vision is stated here in the statement. We are a national network improvement community. We have local and regional Hispanic serving institutions that are emerging or non-emerging. And we have members, educators, and community partners who collaborate to accelerate Latinx representation in STEM education through a culturally responsive experiential learning. As you can see on this photo, we have given permission from one of our community colleges that is Hispanic serving institution that has created a CURES, culturally responsive experiential learning, under our network improvement community. And I wanted to share that because this is a very big deal for the community college to design a CURES at their institution and to also incorporate the culturally responsive practices within their CURES. Before we get to the next slide, I do want to state that our All Rise Alliance, NIC, has been established to first start with our members in a PD professional development in cultural responsiveness. So that's really the biggest piece that we want to give to our members in this NIC community before going in to the improvement science. So next slide. Our continuous improvement components that we see here on this slide is very critical when it comes to having our members, and that's how we refer them to, having our members in the NIC go through a Plan, Do, Study, Act. As I was creating this outline and the continuous improvement components, the main piece that we're really focused on is increasing underrepresented Latinx students in STEM education. And really doing that, we have to look as a NIC is what is our aims? What is the faculty doing? And what do they bring to the table as they're learning that culture responsive piece and have their implementing that in the classroom? So as you see here, we put our aim statement, our drivers, and our challenge ideas into place for all institutions. And I didn't mention that we have 21 Hispanic serving institutions at this moment right now in our network, in our NIC. At this moment, we have 20 Plan, Do, Study Acts in effect for these institutions. So it's been really important to ensure that we are trying to increase that underrepresented Latinx in STEM education. On the bottom, it has the theory of practice improvement. And so keeping that in mind, as a All Rise Alliance, we want to ensure that our focus is developing that cultural responsiveness in an experiential learning. So if that's a cures or work-based experience, that's an important factor that we elaborate as the NIC community. If you look down below, you'll see the PDSA cycle, and that's given to all the faculty on teams that we create for them. We help them go through their PDSA cycle with a culturally responsive lens and making sure that that's been in place for the faculty. So next slide. Here is our aims. And I'll give a little bit brief about that little color one that's on my left side. But our aim statement for our All Rise Alliance is by 2026 is really determined, and the continuous improvement science at our have the institutions be intentional on serving Latinx in STEM and undergrad students, and also making sure that they're offering that cultural responsive experiential learning opportunities. This has been, I would say, a challenge for some of our institutions, because trying to bring everyone together as a team and really having that lens of cultural responsive practices and applying it into the PDSA is where we did the adoption and the adaption in the change of our work. So you can move to the next slide. So in our work, as we saw the network improvement community in our second year kind of form itself, we also needed to keep in mind the audience, our members. Our members are Hispanic serving institutions, and we wanted to ensure that serving our Latinx students and putting in place this network improvement community, and also the Plan, Do, Study Act, that we're really focused on how we're serving our Latinx students and what we're doing in that model. And so giving to make sure that our redesign, our adoption of the Plan, Do, Study Act was not just 60 days, but extending it out to a semester or 2 semesters to ensure that we were disaggregating the data correctly at this institution, looking at inequities in persistence and graduation rates in STEM, and really looking at what the institution, or we call STEM teams, need to do to better serve our Latinx community. was a very big change that we had to do. So what did we do? So next slide. We looked at the theory of practice improvement and we talked about the drivers within that. We talked about how we're going to infuse that cultural responsiveness and being intentional within our institution. How are we going to ensure that our students' culture and assets and strengths are being developed and being harnessed into our work and into our curriculum? And what are we doing to ensure that we're preparing our undergrad Latinx students in the workforce of STEM? It's very critical that every single day our faculty come into the classroom with their own cultural wealth, but also recognize our students, our Latinx students' cultural wealth in their classroom. So it's very critical for that to occur. And as you can see, we also incorporated some examples into our theory of practice improvement. And then in the previous slide, is it okay if you could go to the previous slide real quick? You'll see here how every code piece was indicated 1, 2, 3, and 4. How we really wanted to focus on the network improvement community and how each of those components were really targeted for our STEM team, because we have to think about this in a way of sustainability. We have to think about this in a sustainability model for these Hispanic serving institutions to move forward after the grant has ended. So you can go back to the next slide. Okay, and then go back to the next slide. So how can we do it? Well, with cariño, I say, making sure that our culturally responsive practice is in the center. And when I say cariño, with our heart, with our soul, with what we bring to the table every day. As a Latina in tech, it's very important that I bring my cariño into our faculty support, into what we provide as culturally responsive lenses, and into this Plan, Do, Study, Act. So as we work through the model of Plan, Do, Study, Act, we ensure that all of our faculty are going through the process of a culturally responsive lens with cariño, with support, to ensure that our Latinx STEM students are receiving that every single day in their classroom. That being said, I'll pass it to the next person that's after me. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. I am representing the Native Fuse, the Native Food, Energy, and Water Systems, or FUSE Alliance today. And today, Shelley Valdez and Gianna Capitan of the Native Pathways, Jill Stein of Reimagine Research Group, and I, Cheryl Schwab, at the University of California, Berkeley, will be representing the entire alliance. The Native Fuse Alliance is led by the PIs, Carletta Chief at the University of Arizona, Alice Aganino at the University of California, Berkeley, and John Phillips at the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, or AHEC, who works alongside our backbone director, Kathy Isaacson, who is also in the audience today. We want to acknowledge the work that we are presenting today was conducted through the collaboration and contribution of many Alliance members. And so on the slide here, it shows the different goals of the Alliance. The Alliance prioritizes the leadership of Indigenous faculty, researchers, and students, place-based approaches to teaching and Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing. And our efforts are inclusive and participatory, including both Native and non-Native partners. This diagram represents the shared vision of the Alliance. One, to address urgent FUSE challenges that limit access to food, energy, and water in Indigenous communities. Two, the co-development of integrated Indigenous place-based FUSE curricula, mentoring, and practice experiences. And three, to transform institutions and to be relevant and accessible to Native communities. And finally, to recruit, retrain, and graduate Indigenous students to pursue higher education and careers in Fuse and bring their knowledge back to their communities. Next slide. As a result of programming, outreach, and mini grants, we have over 40 Alliance partners across the US. The size of the bubbles indicate kind of the number of members from each location. And both the University of Arizona and the University of California, Berkeley serve as the anchor institutions. Next slide. And so across the Alliance, there are foundational projects that have provided exemplars of the work being done to achieve our goals. And for example, ACES leads the K-12 Indigenous Curriculum Learning Center, directed by Tasia Zentek, that is providing a central location of Indigenous STEM curriculum. Another example of a foundational project is the Native Fuse certificate led by the University of Colorado, Denver, under the leadership of Timberly Roan, and is creating an Alliance-wide certificate, which includes workshops, internships, and mentorship to Indigenous students pursuing Fuse-related careers. All of these projects contribute to the wise practices and strong community ties within the Alliance. Next slide, and I hand it over to Jill.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. And I'm speaking on behalf and collaboration with our whole evaluation team that put together this presentation together. So I'll just share briefly our collaborative evaluation and facilitation process, just to ground you in how this work has emerged and how that's influenced the NIC model that we use for the Native Fuse Alliance. So we bring together Indigenous and specifically Pueblo worldviews and non-Indigenous Western paradigms of evaluation, just based on the team that we're bringing together between Native Pathways, Reimagine Research Group, and UC Berkeley. So from learning from our Pueblo evaluation team, the process follows the spiral, which is found across the Southwest. And from a Pueblo worldview is a representation of time and space. The spiral also represents the Pueblo's ancestors' migration stories, and reflects in here the kind of key values and processes that influence our approach to this work together. The spiral is alive and dynamic with energy. The center shows that the spiral continues within and that there's no ending, it's continuous. It's organic and emergent and very much centered on relationship and community values. It moves both clockwise and counterclockwise depending on the perspective you're viewing it in. So it has embedded in it this opportunity to reflect back and then continue to move forward based on what we're learning as we go. So we represent the story of Native Fuse as the Alliance moves clockwise on their journey. And when we engage in evaluation and data collection, we move counterclockwise to reflect on the Alliance's journey and lessons, successes, and the new areas that are emerging, so that the Alliance can continue to grow and strengthen their pathway forward. And I'll pass it back to Cheryl with the next slide.
Yeah, just one thing, Jill. The circle animates the core values within the collective of each of our team members, and it's very important that we are mindful of those particular core values because they also are centered within the Indigenous communities we work with. Thank you.
Thanks, Shelley. Glad you could join.
So within the spiral is our connection with the larger includes network and people doing the work across the network. We will, in this presentation, describe the evolution of the network improvement community through a spiral process, grounded in place and values within the Native Fuse Alliance. And we will be addressing the question, what is important for our communities? We describe kind of this organic journey from this outer circle to foster the emergence of culture, norms, and identity, to infuse Indigenous kind of ways of knowing and to foreground the strengths of our Native communities. Next slide.
And this particular slide was built designed during the launch of the Native Fuse. What it represents is a sphelix in the center, that wave, and the wave is, you see this concept and many graphic depictions in indigenous communities. It really centers that flow of life. Within that wave, that sphelix design, are incredibly important colors that are reflective of many indigenous communities. It also, within the sphelix, it also moves along with the core values of the Native Fuse Alliance. Around the sphelix, you see medicine plants. The medicine plants that are from various regions in North America, they are amplified through those Native communities that center Native Fuse work. And those medicine plants are also representing the visions of success within the Native Fuse that we took them through the launch. And it also shows you the different audiences that we really work with, that the collective that make up Native Fuse. Particularly the center are the students, the importance of students and why we're doing this work. Thank you.
So next slide.
So really the first iteration of the NIC model used in the Alliance really included kind of the Plan, Do, Study, Act, the PDSA cycle. We kind of used this model to start our evaluation and really to guide our discussions. So one of the first questions that emerged was, why do we need to adapt the NIC model? So out of those discussions with partners, we really found it was important to ensure that we were being intentional in including kind of a natural and holistic view of living systems, and really to directly achieve the goals of the Native Fuse Alliance. So the Alliance is really utilizing dynamic processes, and we recognize that it's not possible to solve really food, energy, and water problems within Indigenous communities in one way, much less a linear way. So from the gathered gifts of our Alliance community and really our own knowledge systems, in the Southwest, we suggested a metaphor that really resonates with the intentionality of working with tribal communities and representing those Indigenous communities as our partners. So we understand that we're not working, we are working with many Indigenous peoples, and that we really needed to utilize a metaphor that can be adaptive and really responsive to the different contexts and different cultures. So we began this process of presenting the metaphor of an agricultural cycle and seeing kind of how those processes aligned within the work of the Alliance. And if we move to the next slide, we created kind of this visual representation of the Native Fuse Alliance partnerships that really infused the gathered values. We initially kind of invited the partners to participate in a process where we asked them to think about a plant, a particular seed. So this is actually our earlier model. And we wanted to talk about how, in this process, how partners described how they wanted the impact to be around their students and their communities. And so really starting at the center is really the petals of a flower, which represent the students who are really vital to kind of addressing the challenges at the nexus of food, energy, and water systems. Students are really surrounded by partners who are involved within our different institutions, our different communities, and really that all embeds different wise practices through the Native Fuse Alliance, which is all kind of embedded within this kind of larger NSF includes community of practice. So if we move to the next slide, you saw the earlier model. This is kind of the next phase of the model. So our team really recognized a need to reorient the model to kind of fit a more directional and seasonal approach. And so for this reason, we really placed winter at the north position, spring at the east,
summer at the south, and fall at the west. In the center, there is kind of that plan, do, study, act cycle, which kind of stays there, but it highlights kind of the nonlinear progression of the work and really the integration between the stages. There's a little bit more overlap that's witnessed here, and the model is more flexible and adaptive to different people and different communities as we're kind of working with within this kind of process. And so this also kind of aligns earlier with an emphasis on kind of that metaphor and working through that framework that really resonates more with the people we work with rather than what it was looking like before. So I will pass it, or Shelley. Jill.
I think this one is me. Yeah, so we just wanted to reflect on just 3 kind of key findings that have emerged from this through the first few years of the NIC model cycle. And these have really been wrapped around, for the native fuse, around the notion of time, of process, and sustainability. So specifically, Alliance members have shared an understanding of divergence around the different notions of time between Indigenous worldviews and Western systems. And the time needed for the work of the Alliance doesn't necessarily fit into the linear timelines that are often associated with funding streams and with institutional timeframes, and are sometimes at complete odds. So we talk about as a clash of worldviews that the Alliance members are constantly navigating at different levels. Related to time has been this theme of process, and particularly key to the Native Fuse Alliance and the NIC process is flexibility. So as part of building off the model that Gianna shared, this means really watching what is happening in the environment, following the seasons and the natural flow of time and change, which contributes to and guides this flexible and adaptive process of growth and change over time. And then by embracing this whole natural holistic view of living systems, we are watching for collectively and ready to adapt to change. Finally, core to the process is this view of continuity and sustainability, which we view as both an embedded and inclusive activity, and really with that framework of acknowledging both the generations that have come before and contributed the learning and wisdom to our process, and the generations to come. Shelley, did you want to add anything to this slide?
No, I'm good.
Next slide.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. And Shelley, I'll let you say something in a minute. And if anyone has any questions, please, you can put them in the chat. Sorry, Shelley. No? Okay, we'll pass it on to the next alliance.
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you for still being here. I know we're coming up on the hour. I'm Erica Harvey from Fairmont State University, and with me is Sue-Ann Heatherly from Green Bank Observatory. We are 2 of the 5 collaborating PIs for First 2 STEM Success Network, NSF Includes Alliance. The aim of First 2 is to double the graduation rate of rural, first-generation, low-income, and other underrepresented undergraduate STEM students by changing systems within higher education. We started as a statewide initiative in West Virginia. First 2 is currently a 2-state networked improvement community that engages 9 higher education institutions in West Virginia and now Kentucky, and partners with 20 other groups, including nonprofit organizations, state and federal government, and industry. Of our 1,000 members, about a third are students. Next slide, please. A central equity anchor for First 2 lies in our involvement of students as partners in the networked improvement community from the very start. I loved the images from the previous people with the heart in the center and the students in the center. We have a shared commitment to do work not to, not for, but with students. A deep understanding of the obstacles to success for first-gen rural and other underrepresented students in higher education requires the input of students currently in the system. Participating students are paid in the form of stipends. We selected NICS and improvement science as our collective impact methodology after attending an early conference with SRI, and they became our mentor backbone organization when the Alliance was funded in 2018. At this point, after 6 years, we have a collection of high impact practices that are shared and tested across the network, often led by students and also by faculty, staff, and even industry partners who are themselves first generation. Our theory of change has truly been co-created by stakeholders from all different organizations and roles, and we have also evolved a set of processes and supports that recognize the realities of working in higher education. Next slide, please. Our approach is to foster a culture of shared learning throughout the network. Sounds familiar. Institutional teams who carry out tests of change include students, STEM faculty and administrators, and a variety of student success staff members. The cycle at the right shows how we keep the institutional change work centered in and responding to lived student experiences. The improvement science methodology we use consists of diagramming the problem, identifying drivers of change, and testing change ideas through plan, do, study, act cycles. We have worked hard to socialize understanding of improvement science and support fidelity of implementation, and our approaches continue to evolve in response to network needs. We have offered multiple trainings as well as individualized coaching supported by standardized templates and how-to resources. And any team member can suggest a change idea as long as it is aligned with a primary driver and uses shared metrics, and as long as IRB approval is obtained to allow data gathering and sharing with the network. Next slide, please. This slide shows our theory of change. Our aim when we started in 2018 was to double that graduation rate. Maybe with a 2-year delay for COVID, that gives us till 2030. We have 4 primary drivers of change, which have been substantially updated several times in the past 6 years through cross-network input and then approval by our steering committee. For driver 1, for example, we believe that if STEM students succeed academically, that will help double the graduation rate. Similarly for other drivers, meaningful connections with faculty, staff, and peers, feeling connected to STEM research and career options, and engaging in leadership experiences that identify issues impeding success and co-create new solutions. We believe that pushing on any of those should help increase the graduation rate. While our primary drivers are framed in terms of student outcomes to make them easier to measure in ways that point to the overall aim, our secondary drivers are framed in terms of what institutions or other groups with power need to do to make change in support of student success. For example, a secondary driver associated with driver 1 is institutional teams work with campus services to improve student use of tutoring, study groups, and faculty office hours among first 2 students. You notice that we put the responsibility there on the people with power. Next slide, please. I have to say, I loved reading the paper this graphic came from and that we chose it as a theme throughout all our talks, and I strongly encourage it for anyone considering a NIC. We did not have a formal NIC initiation team to carry out the steps in this diagram. Instead, our entire network participated in our root cause analysis and driver diagram creation, and even proposed metrics, with students and partners from all sectors learning and contributing at a series of gatherings and workshops over the first 2 years. Lots of technical assistance was provided by SRI, and the change work was starting while the structures were being developed, leading to a lot of jokes in the early years about building the plane while flying it. In year 4, we transitioned from cross-network working groups to teams centered in institutions, and Sue-Ann will talk about that. We probably would have had a student with us today if it wasn't the very start of the academic year. And to lead into Sue-Ann's slides about measurement and data, I'll just say we are finally really starting to understand the power of designing with the end in mind. Sue-Ann? Next slide.
Awesome, Erica. Let me see, I'll go ahead, I'll try this. I just don't want the network. So First to Network, as you can hear from the slides up to this time, has really gone through an evolution to accomplish our aim. Initially, we had our driver diagram and we created affinity groups across all institutions that were centered around these primary drivers. So you might have a faculty student engagement group or something like this. They were across institutions in the state, and these affinity groups were given complete autonomy to come up with change ideas and test them and measure them any way they wanted to. And this was a good strategy in one way. It resulted in the development of a culture of sharing between our higher education institutions that had been absent in our state, but it didn't result in sort of a data collection or scaling of promising practices at the institutional level that would lead to, systems change at our higher education institutions. So to address those limitations in year 4, we transformed our networked improvement community from these affinity groups to institutional teams based at each college and university. We also realized that having some sort of human touch around the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle process was required to ensure a consistent level of quality in data collection and analysis across our institutions. So in 2021-22, we created the Improvement Science team, and we became coaches to guide institutional teams through the key steps that they were going through as they do the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle. Building on Carnegie Foundation resources, we developed a coaching process where each institutional team reviews and improves its PDSA plan. And this process ensures that the use of common change ideas and common metrics aligned with key drivers in our model for change. We undertook a process of obtaining IRB approvals at every institution so that we could share data, de-identified data, but share data across the network. And that was a big deal. And we continue to socialize improvement science. And our goal is that it becomes part of every institution's culture so that this disciplined inquiry that we're engaging in now to improve student outcomes carries on after the network. We adopted shared processes and outcome metrics. And you can see on the right there in the slide, the outcome measures. And so these we adopted as a means of gauging intermediate progress toward our aim. Some are straightforward, like better GPAs, or do students have persist, or do they remain in good standing in their STEM major as a result of these things we're testing. But others are more effective metrics like self-efficacy, grit, and resilience, and these are self-reported metrics, mostly by students or by faculty, if that happens to be the change idea. We pulled questions from instruments that are available in the literature, so they're based in the literature, and we require the use of these shared metrics in doing a Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle. So on the next slide, we're starting to get some results, and if you think that getting these kinds of results that you're seeing here on this screen happen quickly, we're 6 years in, and it takes some time. But we have been asking schools to give us information about the persistence of any student who has participated in any PDSA, any change idea in any way. And West Virginia University is our largest school and is really able to get this data quite readily through their institutional research folks. So we rely on them quite a bit, but we're starting to get some data from small schools as well. So if you look on the left with WVU, you'll see that we're seeing a persistence of 84% relative to 63% for a similar group of students. And in the Fairmont State side of things, our small school, we have similar results. We have a persistence rate of 92% overall average over 2 years of participating in PDSAs. And we compare that there to the 5 or 6 year graduation rate, just as a piece of data we could get. And so that might not be quite fair, but we can also look at their persistence rate over the same years, and we see that that ranges between 55 and 75%. So even in that case, we're really seeing persistence improve, and we are taking all the credit in the world for that we can. So next slide, to wrap it up here for you, we've got some learnings and some advice for y'all if you're doing this yourself, and that is that changing your actors when you're developing your theory of change in your driver diagram, make the actors that have the most power have responsibility for helping to institute some of these changes. Coaching has really improved not only completion of our tests of change, but high quality, creating some really explicit and shared process and outcome measures. Our contracts have been very important for us. We have contracts or MOUs with our institutions, and that has really helped us get all the way through to get this good data that we're getting now. And finally, just to think about scaling and systems change early on so that You know, that's forefront when you're trying to gauge whether something would be a high impact change idea or not. So this transition, you know, to institutional teams has been the right move, you know, to promote systems change, but we don't want to lose that sharing that happened so freely across teams and across the whole network early on. And so we find that our fall and spring conferences are just killer for promoting sharing. It's a celebration of these change ideas and what has happened at each institution. And there's so much cross-pollination and people picking up each other's ideas. Our student leaders, in addition to being part of institutional teams, are still a network-wide cohort, and they meet regularly as a cohort and discuss their own tests of change that they're doing. And this year we are pooling data across similar change ideas and doing some collaborative paper writing to improve and keep just even elevate this cross-institution sharing that we started out with. So on the final slide there, you will just see that we have a present for you. We uploaded a toolkit to the national network, and that's a screenshot there. It was hard to, that's a very long URL, but all of our coaching handbook, our PDSA templates, the process that we use, the shared metrics and the links to where those came from, all of that stuff is available to you in this toolkit. And we would love for those of you to use it and to tell us what is working, what's not working, and how we could improve this resource. And so thank you very much. I think I'm done. Next slide is just first2network.org and our acknowledgement of support from the U.S. National Science Foundation.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for those amazing presentations. I love the comments in the chat and the joy and acknowledgement of how much work you all have put into each of those things. And we want to give a chance during this webinar, both for people to share and record their responses and feelings to that presentation, and then also give us a chance to break out. So first, Dylan has shared into the chat a Padlet where you can reflect on the things that you've just heard. So what resonates from these shared experiences between the alliances? And I want to say from the Hub's point of view, I'm really excited that all of you we're using shared language as well, because it made it really easy as I was watching each of the different presentations to kind of connect the dots between the work that you all were doing. Secondly, how might your community's strengths or unique environments shape the use of improvement science? Again, in the Padlet from the link in the chat. And then how can Include's national network be helpful as you adapt improvement science to your community? And believe me, we will be looking at those responses for ways to continue to curate amazing conversations like this one. So we're going to give a few minutes for you to contribute, and then I believe we're going to break you out into breakout sessions to give you some time to talk. And I know we had planned for slightly longer with the Padlet to make that time and space for us to think and reflect. But I also want to make sure I give time for the breakout rooms in our agendas. We're running a little behind the agenda now. So if you would select in the poll that currently came out, what sessions to discuss in the breakouts. And I know we're asking you to do two things almost simultaneously with the Padlet and the pop-up that just happened on Zoom. So I want to acknowledge that. But that will help us arrange the breakout rooms in just a minute. As you're all rejoining, thank you to those of you who stayed for the breakout rooms after the initial presentations. And I just want to open the floor for a couple of minutes, as well as the chat. If anyone would like to raise their hand and come off mute and share out what takeaways or reflections that you had from today's session. And I know, Cheryl, I was also in a room that was just having such a great conversation. But hopefully that inspires you all to continue to engage with the network and the hub, and perhaps take this conversation over to the online community, and to continue it in an asynchronous forum, in order to respect all of our time that we've committed to on the webinar today. So would anyone like to share in the chat or raise their hand and come off mute and share your general takeaways from the conversation today?
I guess I'll just say really quickly, there's so much to share. And I feel I'm like overwhelmed with questions, and like, I'm trying to kind of piece together what would be the most useful. So we definitely need to have more, more ways to share and to talk about kind of these real challenges that people have in their alliances. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I share one thought that I put in the Padlet as well. What became apparent to me is that there is no framework that you can fully implement in your place that is being developed and generally published. You always have to adapt. You always have to ask yourself, what are my conditions? What happens in my place? So if I took a lesson away that was reinforced in this session, I think it was exactly that. Don't like have tunnel vision when you use frameworks, whether it's a NIC or any other one.
I love the notion of if we think about in terms of construction, what a framework is, we build upon it. We don't apply it in isolation. And in all of the presentations today, and in many ways that I've become familiar with a lot of the STEM education work, the most inclusive and sometimes most impactful are the ones who've taken that foundational framework and built on it in a way that lifts the voices of students that it's going to be applied to, or integrates the lived experiences of the communities in which we're trying to apply it. And so I think all of you have done exceptional work, and that's one of the things I'll take away. Sarah?
I just wanted to add to this that I think one of the ways that I've seen people really connect to the idea of a network improvement community is to understand that it's a learning network. Networks exist for so many different reasons, and it's really different to be an intentional learning network. And just putting that frame out there, I think, helps people connect with it and understand that it's going to be imperfect and they can just jump in. We're learning together.
Yeah, absolutely. Jill?
I was just going to add, as we were talking about frameworks and the thing I saw across all the presentations, and just thinking about the NIC model as more of a, like, really a process and not a framework. Even I know on our team, we talk a lot about even shifting away from the language of framework, and that it's really a process, because and we talked about that a little bit around measuring progress as well in our breakout, is like that's adaptive and changing, and that, like, yeah, we're not sticking with one thing, that we're continually learning and adapting.
Great. I'm going to ask my colleague Dylan to reshare the slides so we can go through the last two slides in these last 2 minutes. And Jill, give you the final word there as that collective reflection. Just a reminder, there's another upcoming session, evaluating program sustainability, featuring the Aspire Alliance on October 4th. And you'll notice that the hub and the Includes Network is going to really start to lean into LinkedIn as a strong social media communications vehicle. I also want to flag for you to please check your email. So we recently sent out a notice that we're shifting our communications platform, and the email gives you a chance to re-opt in, which of course MailChimp has a requirement for, so that we can stay compliant with all of its policies and privacy policies. And be prepared for some more announcements. We're going to be releasing a new version of the website in late September. We did bring over all of the uploaded resources. So those amazing resources that were shared with the first two network today are going to persist. But maybe some of the things that were shared or comments in the previous discussion board are going to be archived. We'll have access to them, but they'll no longer be part of the general, like, view when you first log in. So please pay attention to your email for some of these changes and ways we might need you to opt in to either re-register or make sure that you're still welcoming the emails from the network and the hub. And with that, I thank you all for joining us today. And I'm just really excited to be a part of this project myself now and learning all of the things that you all are doing in order to advance STEM education out in the world, because the work you're doing to change systems is going to have ripple effects to the future that we can't even see. And it's amazing and hard and complicated and empowering and powerful work for the populations and communities that the Includes Network is really focused on. So thank you all for the work that you're doing and for spending your Friday afternoon with us, or morning, depending on where you are. Thank you.